Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Thanks so much for joining us. In position to attack, Russia has 190,000 troops surrounding Ukraine. United States officials say President Putin has given the word to his field commanders, be ready to invade. Reports also indicate that Moscow has drawn up a kill list.
Desperate diplomatic efforts are underway, with French President Macron working over the weekend to set up a summit between Presidents Biden and Putin. Dale Hurd reports on the latest rumblings of war.
U.S. and French officials say Presidents Biden and Putin have agreed to meet in principle. Now the Russians are saying that's premature. This as Russian forces are poised to attack. Russia Sunday extended its military drills in Belarus along Ukraine's northern border after 2 days of shelling in eastern Ukraine between Russian separatist and Ukrainian forces. CBN's George Thomas says Moscow-backed forces in the east are laying the groundwork for a pretext to invade.
Russia's 8-year-long war against Ukraine in the east has taken a dramatic turn in the last 72 hours. 3 sources that I've spoken to in the occupied territories say they've been notified this weekend that women, children, and the elderly need to evacuate immediately because they allege that Ukraine is preparing for a massive military offensive. In addition, men between the ages of 18 and 60 are ordered to stay behind and to take up arms.
Moscow has as many as 190,000 troops surrounding Ukraine, at least half of them in attack positions. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor describes Ukraine as a hostage in a struggle between Russia and the West.
Ukraine has a gun to its head while the Russians are negotiating with the Americans and NATO and others. And so, yes, they're a pawn in this.
Ukrainian President Zelensky at a conference in Munich, Germany, asked why the West has taken so long to impose sanctions on Russia.
We don't need your sanctions after the bombardment will happen.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken told CNN because once sanctions are invoked, Vladimir Putin has nothing left to lose.
The purpose of the sanctions, in the first instance, is to try to deter Russia from going to war. As soon as you trigger them, that deterrent is gone.
Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin says Russia has amassed enough firepower to take the Ukrainian capital Kyiv, but with mass civilian casualties.
If he employs that kind of combat power, it will certainly create enormous casualties, within a civilian population.
Across Ukraine, civilians are taking part in combat training, preparing to fight if necessary. In the meantime, the U.S. says Moscow has drawn up a kill list, targeting Russian dissidents, journalists, human rights activists, and ethnic and religious minorities living in Ukraine. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
We'll certainly pray for the peace of Ukraine, and my heart goes out to everyone there. They obviously feel like they're a pawn in a much larger game. Russia seems to have backed itself into a corner, and will they actually withdraw from the brink of war? Let us hope so. Let's hope this latest round of peace talks can actually produce peace. But again, my prediction is they'll try to annex those 2 rogue provinces on the eastern side of the country, and that's sort of the end game, if you will, for Russia. They'll declare victory, and then we'll all move on. But the Europe is never going to forget this, and I think one of the unintended consequences for Russia is a renewed and reinvigorated NATO. In other news, a transgender college athlete dominated a women's swimming competition over the weekend. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That's right, Gordon. Leah Thomas, formerly a male swimmer for the University of Pennsylvania, won 3 individual events in the Ivy League Women's Championships, breaking several records along the way. As senior national affairs correspondent Heather Sells reports, Thomas's case provides an example of why some believe transgender athletes pose a threat to women's sports.
As a male athlete, Will Thomas ranked 462 in the NCAA over 3 seasons on the University of Pennsylvania swim team. Now, competing as a female, Leah Thomas has set multiple program records, ranks #1, and has qualified for the NCAA championships in March.
I love to compete, and I just love to see how fast I can go.
16 of Thomas's teammates at the University of Pennsylvania are protesting. They're saying Thomas holds an unfair advantage and should not be allowed to compete against women. Joining them, a few veterans of the swim community, like 30-year referee Cynthia Millen, who has resigned over the situation.
No matter how much testosterone suppression drugs Leah may take, Leah will always be swimming in a man's body. And this is just blatantly unfair. Men will always swim 8 to 12% faster than women. They have larger lung capacity. They have larger skeleton.
The NCAA, however, has ruled Thomas can compete in the championships, refusing to adopt a new USA swimming rule that requires 3 years of suppressed testosterone that would have disqualified Thomas. Thomas began hormone therapy in May of 2019.
I do think that the consequence of allowing Leah to compete at the NCAA championships compromises more than one individual, the person that comes second to Leah. It's the person who doesn't advance into the final 8 because Leah is in competition. It's the athlete that who doesn't advance to the top 16, which is also a point-scoring position.
The trans athlete debate appears to be picking up steam as these real-life consequences sink in. South Dakota is now the 10th state with a law officially protecting female athletes. Governor Kristi Noem says it's about Title IX and women's rights.
Now, there's many different competitions where biological sex isn't that big of a deal, and we don't make accommodations for it in debate competitions or academic speech competitions. But in athletics, it does matter.
It's really just taking a toll on just people's love for the sport in general.
And more female athletes are speaking out. Iowa high school track star Ainsley Erzin is headed for the University of Arkansas and wrote an op-ed in the Des Moines Register, calling on state officials to protect girls' sports.
Unfortunately, if we allow more trans athletes to compete in women's sports, that puts the results way out of female athletes' control.
For now, all eyes remain on Thomas, who, after dominating the women's 200 and 500 freestyle this season, will compete in next month's NCAA championships. Heather Sells, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Heather. Well, today is President's Day, the national holiday honoring U.S. presidents. Along those lines, a new documentary highlights the spiritual life of America's first president and the man known as the father of the country. CBN's Jenna Browder tells us more.
As we celebrate President's Day, a new inspirational documentary is shedding light on the extraordinary life of George Washington. And unlike others, this one dives deep into his faith.
When we look at George Washington, we're clearly looking at the great icon of our country, the United States.
George Washington, one in a 7-part documentary series produced by the Providence Forum.
A man who has given his name to our capital city. He was called the father of this country in his own lifetime. He has been called by historians the indispensable man. They look to Washington as a general.
Author and executive director Jerry Newcomb.
The purpose of this series, which is called the Foundation of American Liberty series. And if anybody asks me, well, what's the foundation of American liberty? It's our Judeo-Christian heritage. It's the fact that our founders said that our rights come from the Creator. And that has been the source of America's greatness. And George Washington, as a man, was indispensable in helping create America.
George Washington really was that man we see kneeling beside his horse, praying.
Our first commander-in-chief who led a ragtag army of farmers and merchants to defeat the strongest military in the world. And when he had the chance to rule, he pushed power away, refusing to be king.
A particular example was one of a handful, which were very important examples of George Washington choosing the Christian type of leadership, servant leadership.
And Newcomb adds, God placed his hand on Washington early in life.
In 1755, when he was a young man in his 20s, and he was an American officer in the British army during the French and Indian War. And there was a massacre that occurred in which all the officers on the American and the British side were killed except one, and that was George Washington. And it wasn't because they didn't try. They actually tried. They even aimed their guns at him. And by God's grace, he was spared. He had horses shot out from under him. He had 4 bullet holes in his cloak. He had to actually write his brother, John Augustine, and send a letter saying, "You may have heard that I died. I didn't, by God's grace."
There's no doubt Washington had God's favor. This documentary highlights that and the ways God was with Washington as a man and as he became the great leader we now celebrate today. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Thank you, Jenna. And for more information on how to watch the documentary, simply go to our website, cbnnews.com. Gordon?
Literally, you can't say enough good things about George Washington, the father of our country. He's noted as a man of prayer, and his writings are filled with this wonderful word for providence. He would look to providence. He was trying to be ecumenical in a time where it wasn't really possible or even permitted. But his letter to a Rhode Island synagogue goes down in history as one of the great letters extolling religious tolerance in the new nation, America. His command of generals, and then the inspiration he gave them. And this is a rarely understood part of American history. The colonial army, the Revolutionary Army, they took an oath, and they called themselves the Order of Cincinnatus, that they were not interested in any position in the upcoming government, that their whole aim, once they won the war, is to be like Cincinnatus, who was a hero from the Roman Empire.